Jon, I'm excited to really jump in and talk about product marketing and your experience as this role has grown, right? Because you were there in the early days.
Yep.
When it wasn't really even a thing, it wasn't even really a title per se. It was just something that people were gravitating towards and trying to shape. And you were part of that all the way up to where you are now as a group vice president. But why don't we jump in? How does an English lit major end up in the Bay Area and then end up in product marketing or towards a trajectory towards product marketing?
Yeah, somewhat dumb luck, and then somewhat by the grace and the kindness of some of the professors I had, the English professors I had as an undergraduate, who were like the ghosts of Christmas future. And at the time, I mean, some of them were younger than I am now, but they were tenured, and they were very kind and very supportive in the sense that, like, we can tell you love English and you're a pretty good writer, but there are no jobs in academia, especially in the humanities. And I remember I had one professor who I had done an independent study with, and she was great. I'd taken a bunch of classes with her, and she literally said, I will write you a recommendation for graduate school. So I started studying for the GRE. She's like, but I'm going to wait a year. You have to go do something else, do anything else. And if you can't possibly avoid it, then I'll come back, but don't go right away. And then the other thing that was interesting, I took a philosophy class, I remember, with adjunct faculty. So I don't know if you know about the sort of the perils of adjunct faculty in, he was on the academic job market and couldn't get a job. And I remember walking with him one time after class, and I don't know, we're talking about the Frankfurt School, but it was something like that. And I remember him saying he had gone to the University of Texas as an undergraduate. I think he was a classmate of Michael Dell. It seems like right from a timing standpoint. He said, you know what, I wish I'd gone into computers. And I was just like, this isn't good, because I really admire this guy. And it feels like, the universe is pointing me in a different direction. And, this was at a time in the late 90s in his school, this was super influential. The internet kind of came out when I was in college, even though I wasn't a computer science major, but I remember using the first browsers. I remember using early sort of early user group technology, and it was just part of doing our coursework. And the influence of that with the timing of, Netflix's IPO, which now feels like a gazillion years ago and nobody thinks about it, was really influential. I remember people talking about it. I remember sitting with my friends in West Philadelphia, and someone said, yeah, I heard that even the person who worked at the front desk made millions off their stock. And I was like, I don't understand how that works. So that was sort of like planted in the back of my brain. And I got towards the end of college, and it was the summer before my senior year. And I realized my gut just told me, like, I don't know what I'm going to do. It's a complete jump into the darkness, but all of these signs, all these people that I like and respect, and all, just telling me to go in a different direction. I actually think my humanities background was super important because it taught me much more about abstract thinking and problem solving and synthesis and storytelling, all the stuff that we'll talk about later when we get to sort of product marketing and sort of the rise of product marketing. Whereas learning how to VI a file or how to SSH into a server is a skill. And there's a different thing. And I felt like as I was acquiring these skills, I still had the overarching framework of learning how to read and write and think and read and write and think in particularly when I was in humanities, it was deconstruction and it was post-structuralism. Like, it was hard stuff to figure out. I mean, it was, I still sometimes feel like I'm reading Derrida backwards, but it all was planted away for later. Yeah.
Yeah. But you got a real classical education, right? In the truest sense.
Yes. I realized the difference, Yeah, I realized that difference as I moved on in my career. I remember I would go to different places. My stint at Microsoft, I think, was probably the first place where I felt like I was immersed in people who had grown up as engineers and grown up as computer science majors. And I realized, they don't, you can't really make a Madame Bovary reference because they didn't read it. because they didn't have electives. Like stuff like that. You're like, oh, geez, yeah, they may not know who Wagner is. And it's one of those things that, I get sometimes worried. A friend of mine is a professor. He's a labor relations professor at Cornell University. And we talk sometimes around like that balance between, it's particularly in America, but I imagine it's also true in the UK and Western Europe, where, the sort of conflation of education and job training. So it's interesting how all that education, which felt useless to me in my early 20s, all I think has been sort of what I've drawn on certainly the last 10 or 15 years of my career.
Yeah, you taught how to think, and I love when you start talking about science too, because you're saying all the signs were pointing, right?
Yeah.
You're still a deep thinker, right? I mean, you still, is that a fair statement? I
don't know. I try to, but I still like to read stuff, and I still, I don't know. I just feel really grateful, and I feel really grateful for everything I learned from those professors, and I also feel really grateful that they steered me away from a disastrous career where I probably would have failed to get tenure anywhere, and God knows where I'd be right now. So yeah. And I also realized, hey, there's something happening out west. One of my best friends from undergraduate who had gone, it was an investment banker out here in San Francisco. So there used to be a firm, it's long gone and bought up by JP Morgan and stuff, called Hamburg and Quist. And they were doing a lot of early IPOs, early tech IPOs, like Ask Jeeves and stuff like that. And so I just had a sense that there was stuff happening out here. And yeah, I just had this moment, when I was probably 24, where I was like, I'm going to quit my job and I'm going to give up my apartment and I'm going to fly to San Francisco and move there with what I can fit on the plane. And I slept on my friends' floors and couches for probably 2 months. I remember that friend who was at Hamburg Quiz at the time, my friend John, he let me sleep on his floor, and I had a job. So it took me 2 weeks to find a job because it was still like the tail end of the dot-com boom. 2 weeks to find a job. It took me 2 months to find an apartment. It was like classic San Francisco, boomtown stuff. And yeah, that sort of started another phase. But you would walk into these startups, and there was more enthusiasm and probably more funding than there was, sound business operations. And just figured stuff out. You figured out how to get stuff done and how to build stuff. And one company would fold, and then you kind of get the next job. And what I realized is I was able to, because I was lucky and I worked with some really good people. Like I learned I just picked up skills that I think about all the years I spent at Splunk. And one of the things that I think was one of the most valuable experiences I had early on that helped me I was at Splunk almost 7 years. Was very early on in my career. I was a product manager at a startup, which means, you kind of do everything. So I was doing stuff that later you do product marketing. I was creating test plans. But one of the things we were doing was we were supporting production machines, and I was SSHing into boxes and like grepping logs. And I basically felt the empathy that, 6-7 years later, Splunk solved that problem as an actual practitioner. And I never would have guessed that. It just felt like a dumb thing I was trying to do, or I had to do for my job. And it was all the stuff that was sort of filed away. So yeah, it was an interesting kind of exploratory time. But I moved out there with nothing. I had a couple of friends, and it was definitely white knuckling, because within probably 6 months of me getting there, there were the first fissures in the first dot-com boom economy. There was a sense of like, hey, maybe we've overexpanded here. There was and it's funny, I would love to go back. Someone should do a documentary on like the weird dot-com Super Bowl ads from whoever played in like the 2000 Super Bowl.
Right.
And then within a year, you could tell it was unwinding. And
I was in finance back then. I remember like people that wouldn't take your phone call in 99 and 2000, they were desperate for money, right? They were begging for phone calls and say, hey, we'll show you anything and everything. Was product marketing a term that you gravitated towards, or did you just kind of start moving towards that direction and it became product marketing? I hadn't heard the term product marketing for years. So I was a product manager, and I think there were 2 or 3 startups where I was the first product manager in, which again just sort of meant like I was a utility player. Like I was,
kind of doing all the things. There was some stuff that you would think of like classic product management in terms of like, what should we build? And this is all pre-agile. So like I'm writing these long functional scripts in waterfall processes, but I'm also, I'm also creating sales decks for reps, and I'm also writing web copy. And it was just one of those things that, especially early on, you just kind of have to do all the things. And that's when I was, I didn't realize I was doing product marketing work. I just sort of felt like it was part of the job as a product manager. And then the interesting thing was when I went to Microsoft, so I did the startups I think I worked at 3 startups for 5 years. All of them failed, some of them in spectacular ways that are hilarious. And if anyone remembers like Valleywag or some of the good old, now I feel like I'm 1,000 years old, but like any of the good old like kind of Silicon Valley .com era gossip rags, like, I worked for a couple of companies that were all over those, that were just a hot mess. I also realized, like, I think I realized I like this, I like the pace. I needed a little bit more background and foundation, and I needed, especially in a down economy. So I do what all people do in a down economy. I go to grad school. I want to help. I want to work with your portfolio companies. I don't want to be a VC, but I don't know what you guys do. I don't know what you care about. I don't know what a cap table is. I don't understand liquidity preference. And basically, there's this great venture fellows program at the University of Texas in Austin. Big up to Jim Nolan, who is still running that program, which kind of teaches you the mechanics of it, and then you're hands-on working with the firms. And towards the end of my time with Silverton, I remember asking Bill, I was like, all right, would I? I've now done this. I mean, I'm about to graduate with a newly minted MBA. I know my 4 Ps. I've read my Porter. I can talk all about Jeffrey Moore and all that good stuff. It's like, would I survive a B round? He did a lot of kind of early stage investing, A, B round startups, and he's like, no, you wouldn't. You would. I'd have to get rid of you, right? I'd have to upgrade you. You would not be someone with your experience to sort of grow a company under. And then I asked him, I was like, what do I need to do?
When you got that feedback, what did that feel like?
I felt good. I mean, Bill's the greatest guy in the world. He's super honest and super transparent. And like, I think there's a part of me that also knew I was wildly unqualified for it. It doesn't stop some of the folks in the ecosystem, but he was great because he was so honest about it. And he's like, you need to see scale. He's like, you need to go someplace and see scale. Because the problem with startups, and I've worked at startups at various stages and various levels, and startups are great, but like the problem set is different. And the thing that kills a lot of startups, and you can read this in Brad Feld or any number of kind of startup thinkers, is growth is often a killer of startups because it's like the dog that caught the car, right? What do you do now? And the part of that, the way you solve that, and which is why you see companies as they grow, they add people from name companies. So someone who's seen scale, people who know what a big machine looks like.
They're not intimidated by it, they're used to it. They know how to manage it, ride that wave. Yeah, right. I get it.
And so I went to Microsoft. And so I was at Microsoft.
From the startup world, what did you like about being at Microsoft compared to your startup experiences? And what did you miss from those early experiences? Like, what was the compare and contrast?
Well, I wasn't worried about getting laid off every quarter, which was great. And looking back, and I wish I said I'd planned it, I did ride out the kind of financial crisis of 2008 and beyond at Microsoft. So I felt like that was a big piece of it. And Microsoft was also around a lot of really smart people who've done a lot of really cool things. I think the startup world is great, but in many cases, you're around a lot of folks who have more enthusiasm than experience, and just haven't done the thing before. Again, going back to Bill Woods, you need to go see scale. So it's a lot of scrappy figuring stuff out, throwing stuff against the wall, but it's different than saying, oh no, we know how to do things. We know how to roll stuff out. I mean, I worked on a technology called Silverlight. I was I was technically a product manager, but really my title was product manager. I was really doing product marketing. And it's the idea that, within just just marketing that, just driving that adoption among .NET developers. We had 1 million Silverlight developers in a year. That's, there's really no comparison, especially on the enterprise side, for what you'd see to startups. So that kind of scale was great. The process, it took longer to get stuff done, but things had consequences. I think, or especially early on, coming from a jack of all trades type product manager from startups, there were times I felt a little boxed in, where the division of labor felt like, well, this person does that, and we're cutting it too finely and we're boxing people in. But I don't know. I think that forced a little discipline on me. And at the end of the day, you have really smart people, and Microsoft mattered. This is before sort of the Satya Renaissance. Even then, it just, the footprint was so large and it mattered so much when we rolled stuff out. And that was so different from startups, where half the job is getting anyone to care about you. Nobody cares about you. You don't have any customers. I mean, that's what you can do. You can move fast and break all you want at a startup, because you're alone and no one cares what you do. And I realized it was certainly a different situation at Microsoft. So it was a good experience. I was there almost 5 years. I learned a lot. But I was, when it was time to go, I was ready to go.
How did you know? How did you know it was time to go? Internal? Was this something internally that you?
It's another one where I take advice from people. There's a guy, I've been best friends with his sister since college. This guy, Brian Goffman, who's now at McKinsey. He used to be at Madrona Ventures. So in Seattle, I was up in Seattle. They're kind of two big VC firms in Seattle that kind of run the town, right? It's Ignition and Madrona. And he had been at Madrona for a while, and I remember his saying is like, don't spend any, this advice, and I don't know, hopefully Brian won't get mad at me, but he's basically like, don't spend any longer than 5 years at Microsoft, because we flagged those resumes at Madrona, because those folks, it's like animals in the zoo that can't hunt anymore. You get really comfortable. Like you basically, because Microsoft is so big, it almost has its own weather system, right? You don't really operate in the market. You operate in Microsoft.
You can insulate too, right? You get to kind of like you said, yeah, right. What a great piece of advice. I never heard that before. What a great piece of advice.
It was 4 years and 10 months when I left. Yeah, so that kind of brings us to Splunk, which is a nice breaking point.
And Splunk was not what it is today, right? I mean, it had promise, but it sounds like you didn't see it. Like, how can I put this to make sense? Did you see how big it would get?
No, I had, I was in, trying to heed the advice. I kind of did the rounds in Seattle. I went to talk to Madrona and I talked to Ignition. Ignition had done a big investment in Splunk early on, and they were opening a Seattle office. And they were opening a Seattle office in part because as they were looking to scale the business, they realized, being kind of growing up out of open source, and Splunk 1.0, which is now forever ago, way before my time, launched, I think, at a Linux conference. And there was concern on the board and the investors that it doesn't work well enough in the Windows ecosystem. It wasn't a great tool for Windows Server, and this sounds like a million years ago because it was cloud and Office 365. It didn't do a great job with things like Exchange logs, and so they needed to open a Seattle office to do two things. One, make it work better with the Microsoft ecosystem, and then the second piece was it was an IT tool, and they realized it needed to be a platform, and to be a platform, you need to attract developers, and so there were no APIs, there were no SDKs, there's no way to build on and extend the platform, and so they opened the Seattle office to start to build out some of those capabilities in 2011, late 2010. And then I was hired about a year later to be the marketing guy for that. So that was the first time I didn't have a product manager title. And I came in, it's like, all right, you're the, essentially doing product marketing for the dev platform for Splunk. And, a number of things just sort of came out, sort of a number of forces advantageously just sort of popped up that made it, kind of grow like a weed that we couldn't have foreseen. I think, as the natural adoption of cloud and digital transformation meant that, people's applications and their infrastructure just got more gnarly. and it became harder to troubleshoot. And if you could put all the logs in one place, it'd fix it. Well, great. That's what Splunk does really well, right? The emergence of DevOps as a trend, and I totally lucked out on this one. There was a bunch of stuff that the executive team did really well, and that I'm forever grateful for, and I learned a ton from. But there was also just, kind of right time, right place, right time in terms of what was happening in the market. And I tried to capitalize and hold on as much as Splunk, especially at the time, was like a mechanical bull, and you had to hold on and keep going.
I asked you about that because the company's growing like crazy. That means you have to stretch as well as a professional individual, right?
Yeah.
Were there any internal stressors for you in that?
All the time. It was the first couple of years were brutal working there. Yeah. It was great. And in the sense of it was really challenging, and, you were never bored, but it's a company growing that fast, and maturing that fast. It's, you're bound to bounce up against stuff. And we were very lucky that the executive team, Godfrey Sullivan, who was the CEO when I joined and later became the chairman of the board, was laser focused on solve customer problems. If you're not solving customer problems, you're wasting your time, which I think was a very different approach than, now people don't really use the term big data to the same degree they did then, but there was all this hype and there was all this sort of froth in the market around big data and the Hadoop ecosystem, right? And you think about Cloudera and MapR and Hortonworks, and all of them were talking about MapReduce, and they were talking about the technology and the stack. And we were talking about customer problems. We were talking about fixing and finding bugs in production and getting your website up running faster, and then eventually solving security problems. And I think that's why we won. But there was there was a lot of pressure on all of us, particularly on the go-to-market side. We had to be super technical. I mean, early years, I was building my own demos in Splunk. Yeah. Again, my paltry JavaScript skills and stuff were brought back under duress. But we could, everything had to be validated through customers who were constantly working with reps, and we're working with practitioners. It was just, it was an insane pace. It was great. I'm forever grateful for that experience, but it wasn't super comfortable. But it was all smart people trying to do good stuff while the wheels were turning super fast.
Did you ever personal stuff where you're like, I'm not sure if I'm up for this. I'm not sure if I can, I'm barely hanging on. But,
Oh, yeah. I remember I thought the CMO who hired me, the late Steve Sommer, really, brilliant guy. I'll be forever grateful. I think there's a ton I learned from him about marketing is not a service organization. When done right, marketing is a strategic partner and just as important as any other function in the business, which is very different. I think flows counter to, I think, a lot of enterprise software and certainly the Valley, right? In the Valley, especially in startups, like you either write code or carry a bag or else you're a support staff. And I think that that's a prevalent attitude or a prevalent bias, and it shows in a lot of the companies. Steve was very different. Steve Sommer was, a lot of the customer centricity came from him. Like, we didn't launch product. We wouldn't do a press release around product launch without 3 customer references. And this is when we had hundreds of customers. Like, there wasn't a huge pool. And that's a discipline. I mean, I went to much bigger companies and tried to bring that idea, and people were like, no, just, build it and ship it. And that idea that, success is a clean compile and you just ship it to production. Steve was very much focused on, it has to make sense to customers. It has to make sense to the market. You have to be demonstrably proving customers right. And if he felt that you did not meet that standard, he let you know. So I remember it's so funny because I remember there was a marketing offsite. I think the entire marketing team for Splunk at the time, there may have been 30 of us in the entire marketing organization. This would have been like the summer of 2012. And I just joined a few months before, and I did a presentation, and it was very exploratory, and it just wasn't what I wanted. And I remember walking out of the meeting and be like, I got to find a new job because this isn't going to work out. Yeah, I called a friend of mine who had just he left Microsoft as well. I was like, hey, I think you might need to pull me over. And there were a lot of people who didn't make it. I mean, Splunk was notorious for having people come, and especially in that time period, they'd last 2 months, 3 months, 4 months. People would burn in and out. It's a testament. I was lucky. I had a couple people who were looking out for me, but it was not. You had to wear a helmet. You had to. We would have regular meetings in San Francisco. We'd fly down, and I'd joke that I'd have to, wear a mouthpiece to that meeting. I think that's the first time I actually had a title that says, "Oh, I'm in product marketing," right? And Steve, it's funny that there's like a cohort of us. I think what was there, maybe 5 or 6 product marketers who were there at the time, and many of whom have gone on to do great things and be CMOs of public companies, and we all run into each other. We'll chat every once in a while, or. It's funny, for a while, we were all getting called for the same jobs by the same recruiters. But we were all, all generally experienced. It was like 10 plus years. Steve grew, he came up as a product marketer. So that generation of CMO, product marketing is the lead line to CMO. So there was no, it was very exacting on how we worked with analysts, very exacting on sales enablement, very exacting on our launch plans. It made me better without question, but it wasn't fun.
It's like a master's class. It's like a craftsman's class. I'm thinking an old fashioned, just a craftsman, right? Going through craftsman school. Is that what it felt like?
Yeah, but the thing that is really hard to replicate was the product was amazing. It's the best product market fit. Like, that's the thing that was great. We didn't have to make stuff up. We were differentiated enough because I remember Godfrey Sullivan was really clear, and Steve Somer as well. Like, don't call us big data. We're not a big data company. If the market wants to call us a big data company, fine, they can. But we talk about machine data. We're going to position ourselves. We'll talk about that a little later because it's sort of like proto category creation. But at the heart of that was the people who used our product. We saved. We got them home early. Like, it was this step function utility. Again, I dabbled a little bit earlier in my 20s and SSHing the boxes and doing all that kind of stuff. But for real practitioners who all of a sudden were stuck with outdated tools and trying to keep their environments up and running as things were getting more complex, Splunk was a godsend, and they loved us. And that means they wanted to speak on our behalf. I mean, it's the only, it was the craziest experience because I'd come from Microsoft, and especially the years that I was at Microsoft, it wasn't the coolest years. It was the years of the Zune and the kin and missing out on the phone and missing out on search. But I would, I'd get on I was constantly flying back and forth between San Francisco and Seattle. I'd get on the airport, I'd get on the plane with a Splunk backpack, and people would stop me and be like, "I use Splunk in my job. It's awesome." People, we'd work the booth at shows. I mean, people don't say that about enterprise software. That's bananas.
No, it was like a cult following even nearly. And I can imagine.
Yeah. I mean, it had the cult following of an open source project, but it wasn't an open source project. It was, enterprise software. And so that's the thing, in terms of like, to put together customer stories and put together, technical white paper. We had great stuff to work with because the product was great and customers loved it and they couldn't stop talking about it. And that's really hard to replicate.
The environment you were in was so intense and so tough, right? It was tough on you. Like you said, you come down for the meetings and you brace yourself. You probably have some nuts in your stomach, and then you probably had a couple of beers or a couple of drinks in the plane home, unwinding, right? Did that force you in some way to have to be tough on people under you? Like was it a trickle-down effect?
Not initially, no, because I came in as an IC. So that's another thing, is one of those, you figure out, when do you hit your accelerator? Like, that was my big accelerator. I was an individual contributing director when I joined Splunk. So nobody worked for me, and I was off doing like developer stuff. So there was like a weird cohort of us who even knew what that stuff was. But I was also really clear because I think I'd seen some nastiness at Microsoft, and I just didn't want to work that way.
Yeah.
So I was very conscious of, and this also, just sort of my personality. Like I will punch up, and I've probably gotten in trouble in my careers by not being as maybe reverent or at least as quiet as I should be in certain meetings. But I'll never punch down, and I always sort of felt like that's a mistake. It's just not how I want to ever be or be perceived. Life's too short. The world's too small. So I don't think it made, I don't think it was like a sort of cycle of all of a sudden I became, a tough customer on other people, but it did eat up a lot of your cycles, right? You're thinking about stuff a lot. And so, there's a cost to it. But
hard to see people leave. Was it emotionally hard to see so many people come and go? Or did you after a while? It's just
a little bit, yeah. It was Splunk, and I've talked to people. There's a huge Splunk diaspora, and we run into each other, especially when I was at New Relic. I'd see all these people I worked with before at other companies, and people were unusually tight. I think because it was so intense. And it was so successful that people were there all the time. I mean, the San Francisco office, especially when they opened it, there was this kind of bar at the top floor, and people were there all the time. People got married, and people had kids, and people had fights. Like it was a very close knit culture that I hadn't really seen anywhere else. But yeah, the interesting thing though I learned though, and this is, as soon as I got there, so I joined Splunk in May of 2012, and literally a week and a half or so after the actual IPO date. So I'd signed before, but I had to finish out some work at Microsoft, and the founders left right away. Right, so Eric Swan and Rob Doss, the two technical founders of Splunk. They got to the IPO, but they weren't interested in doing bigger company stuff and scaling, and so they left. And so there was this sense of, which I think kind of contributed to the culture of, everyone has to be really good, but everyone's replaceable, right? And so we'd have these people that were cultural sort of touchstones in the organization, or the people that wrote the search language. Everyone leaves, right? You see stuff where the top salesperson one year would leave, then the next person would be the next top salesperson. Like it was this sort of sense of like there was a humility to it. We were all replaceable, right? And it was hard because you were emotionally tied to people, but you realize that the business was such a juggernaut, and it's generations of people. I've been gone 3.5 years or so. There's so few people that are left that I know or who would know me from there. But there was definitely a sense of regime change at various points. But that initial, the founders have left from day one, and they're the technical founders, and this thing's still a juggernaut, was an interesting lesson to take, because I think that's counter to the mythology around a lot of tech companies. Having an awesome product is great. Like it solves those problems. And the discipline that Steve did and other folks, Aaron Sweeney, who was at Splunk for a really long time. I remember before I left, we did a 10-year. The company had only been around like 11 or 12 years. She was there 10 years at the time. She was there even longer. She was sort of field marketing and did lots of stuff. But we had this discipline that came out of some of the work that she did. We do these sales conferences, regional sales conferences called Splunk Live. We do them all over the country and all over the world. And the whole point was, let's make the customer the hero. So there'd be a little bit of hand waving from a Splunk executive and some breakouts that are technical and hands-on. But the whole idea was find, practitioners. So I think of like shorts and sandals and hoodie type practitioners who are using the product, get them on stage and have them tell their story. And they told their story to the product marketers. The whole point of the PMMs, what we were doing at the time is we were putting those decks together. We were doing the interviews. And so that's what helped us figure out, like, that's honestly so much of the messaging that worked came right from customers' mouths because we interviewed them all the time. Because you do 15, 20, 30 of those interviews, you do the pattern recognition. And then I realized, especially at scale at a large enterprise, 90% of product marketing is pattern recognition and synthesis, right? And that's the job. Yeah. So basically, why did I leave? What happened with the departure? I mean, I've been there almost 7 years, which is great. And I felt as if I got way further than I ever thought I would get. Remember, I didn't think I was going to make it a year. And I actually thought for me, that job was going to be a reset after Microsoft as like, all right, let me just land somewhere, learn a couple things, and I'll figure it out. Maybe I'll be there a year or two. So I'm there at year 6. And yeah, I mean, a lot of it is sort of regime change. There's at a certain altitude, and, anyone can tell you this is why what CMOs last 18 months on average. It's easier. It's like being deeper in water. The deeper you are in the water, you're not going to feel the waves up top. So there had been a series of regime changes, and the people that I sort of came up with had left, and then the people that I kind of got in there had left, and then the people that when I sort of reached the highest that I'd gotten were starting to move, and the business was changing. And then I also I had gotten an itch of wanting to do something different, particularly. I always kind of had in the back of my mind, which is interesting because I think I pivoted on it later. I knew I didn't build Splunk. Splunk was already that product was already awesome in 2012. There were only 400 companies and only 120 million revenue. That's a ton of money, but compared to where the company is now. But the pattern recognition, everything I did in product marketing, what I think I did really well was about scaling, right? How do you build repeatable processes? How do you build a machine rather than have ad hoc random acts of whatever. And, but I was acutely aware that there was a community of folks that were the generation or two before me there that built that place, right? Who were there when it was nothing, when they had no customers, and they didn't have any $50,000 deals, much less, $5 million deals. And I thought part of me, going back to my experience in my 20s, I was like, now it's time for me to go back. Now I can go back to Bill Wood. And I think of Bill Wood in Austin saying like, I can do it now. I'm going to survive this B round. And I went and I thought like, let me go run marketing at a startup, kind of like Steve Sommer did. I'm a product marketing leader. I've seen scale. I've seen hypergrowth. Let me go see if I can find another one of these rocket ships. And once I got there and I did it, it was, a lot of really smart, it was a really great company, very smart people. Sequoia backed. I just realized I'm not a startup guy anymore. I'm a scale person. And I realized the thing I do well, I think is much more around sort of pattern recognition, building machinery and repeatability versus just making it work for now. And there are people that are great at that. And I think that by and large, I think the mythology of the Valley and the mythology of startups will always kind of value that. But it just wasn't what I did. It wasn't really what I wanted anymore. So that was kind of my return, who knows what happens in the future. But to me, it's like, oh yeah, I think I'm done with startups now. I like running teams. I like running and building teams.
Was that a powerful, was that a moment of clarity? Was that a pretty powerful insight?
Yeah, because I sort of felt like I should have known that about myself before I took the role, and I wanted to be as fair as I could to the rest of the team, But startups, this happens with that turnover and with transitions and change. But yeah, it was a little bit humbling, but I think part of it was. I probably shouldn't have done anything after Splunk. And I had a couple of friends, actually, my friend Paul, who I worked with at Microsoft, who's one of the people who brought me to Splunk. He took, I think, 9 months off after Splunk just to decompress, right? And I have a couple other friends who just needed time to get the sort of tingling out of their brain from working in that place. And I didn't. I went like from one place to the next without really stopping and being like, we're like really checking in with myself. But that's a lesson to learn.
Your take on product marketing today, what you're doing, and just if your advice you would give other product marketers right now. I mean, it's
sure. I'm super excited about sort of where product marketing is today, because I think it is a real discipline. People realize that the secret sauce, and again, there's a lot to attribute to that. I think the glut of startups, the glut of technology. We have no shortage of open source projects. We have no shortage of widgets and bytes. The hard part is having a coherent story that connects with buyers, which brings us back to sort of the more subjective and non-mechanical aspects of go-to-market and specifically product marketing, right? So there was a generation kind of 10, 15 years ago that was all about growth and demand gen and sort of building that engine and the mechanisms around how do you get leads and nurture people. And there's still a lot of, team folks that are doing that. But what got lost was the so what? Why do I care, right? And I think the storytelling aspect of it, and the play bigger guys, that book and the category creation was sort of maybe the tip of the spear of that, is sort of that articulation of like, what problems are you solving for whom, and how do you tell it? How do you tell it in a meaningful way in a super crowded landscape? Because it just became too hard to differentiate based on product capabilities anymore. Every company just sounds too much like themselves. I remember, even at Splunk, when I'd hire kind of young PMMs, we'd go to a big show like a Cisco Live or reInvent. And especially, for newer folks who may not be new to the industry, I would take them from booth to booth and look at their slogans and be like, can you tell the difference between these two companies? And no, they all look the same, right? Like, it's so hard. And I think that product marketing as being the nexus of, we know what the product does, like we can empathize with it, like we are credible and fluent in talking about how stuff works and what problems it solves, and we can empathize with it. We know how to use the product. We know how to build demos in the product. We know how to use we've used other products, so we know what the difference is. But like, give me the big animal picture. Can you tell a story about that? You can not get lost in the weeds. And I think you can tell, and this is something I learned at Microsoft, I can tell right now where either there isn't product marketing or product marketing gets overruled by engineering or other teams in the organization, because it looks like their website just shipped their release notes, right? You can tell that. I mean, you can see that in the artifacts they create. You can see it in the videos that they do. And even for really technical, and I come from a dev marketing world and developer marketing world, and there's sort of sense of like, you can't market to developers. Developers hate marketing. Like, that's BS. It's not true. Developers are human beings like everybody else. And yes, you have to give them sort of more credible hands-on technical work, but cut to the chase. Why do I care, right? And so you may have to position that cut to the chase. Why do I care? And that again goes back to synthesis, and it goes back to sort of narrative and storytelling. And to me, that's the really hard part. That's the more differentiated, that's the rarer skill set. And a lot of that's located in product marketing. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of people think they want product marketing, just because they've read some startup blog. That's the thing about startups. Your first hire should be a product marketer. Well, maybe it depends on sort of where you are. But the most important thing about product marketing is you got to let product marketers be product marketers. And I think in the worst case scenarios, product marketers become sort of short order cooks for the rest of the business. And if you're on your heels and you're reactive, like, you're not getting good product marketing. You're essentially just you're essentially just running people in circles, and you're not going to get the thing you want out of it. And it's a hard discipline, right? It's a hard thing. This goes back to sort of respecting marketing as a first-class citizen, along with sales, along with product, along with other key functions in the organization. And there's a gap there. But the companies that I think are doing really well have really good product marketers, and they let product marketers be product marketers.
It's the perfect blend of like art and science, right? It's a mixture of that too. How does an organization utilize product marketing effectively? How does it position it? How does it utilize it? How does it lean on it to drive?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's again, I think it's, you know, if the interface, I always think of it as like a hub role. It's a hub function. It sits in the middle of everything. And you should be working with product and engineering to figure out, hey, what are we building and why? Like, or actually with the executive, I mean, the very lucky, there was a couple of leaders at Splunk when I was there, Rick Fitz and Hyen Song, who I was very much plugged into that. And it was this idea of, all right, what are we building and why? What are the strategic goals at a high level? Like product market should be part of that conversation as well, right? What do we do? Why are we, right? And doesn't mean that's a formal, Jeffrey Moore positioning statement, but at least the idea of the sort of strategic reason for being. Product marketing should have a view into that, and then that cascades down to what are we building and why, and how's it? What problems are we solving for whom, and how's it different from the other stuff out there? And I think like if you think about it like an API or a handoff, it sounds simple. It's really hard to get, but like that is the ideal situation. That the product marketing and product management, like, handoff and buddies is, hey, I'm in product management. I got to build this thing. I think product management is interesting as things have, one of the things I think that's been interesting in my career is, especially as I've kind of veered more towards product marketing, is product management, I think, has become more technical. It could be because of the emergence of all these, open source and cloud and all this stuff, but it feels like product management is veering close, has, at least in most of the places I've been with the function I've worked with, they're much more tightly aligned with engineering than they are with the full business. Like I've been shocked how many product managers at really successful companies like don't know how reps are comped. It's just like, why you're building this thing, you don't know how the person is supposed to carry it to customers even is getting comped on this. And it's because I think there's this over reliance on engineering. That being said, I think that's, just sort of the state of the world. If the product team can, you take the strategy down from the executives and product team say, we're going to build this thing to solve this problem for these people. It doesn't have to be super articulate. Then product marketing can take that and build that into a story and build that into a narrative and a go-to-market plan. And how do you go launch stuff? Then how do you go activate the other functions in marketing? How do you activate the campaign team? Because how do you work with a sales enablement? How do you, if you have a direct sales model, if you have a more modern product-led growth cloud company, like sort of an Atlassian and some of those companies that I really admire, like product marketers are the ones that are moving people towards the decision to buy by curating what the experience is inside the box. Once you start either a free trial or a free tier or whatever that experience is. And so again, when you set them up to do those things really well, it's great because then they're, good product marketers will have the judgment and have the experience because they're close to product, because they're close to customers, because they, hopefully are doing ride-alongs. I used to fly to the Midwest and do ride-alongs with sales teams because there's one thing to build a sales deck. There's another thing to sit in a room and watch an SE that you've never met before present it. And you can't replicate that experience. But if you pull all that stuff together, you're able to make good decisions. Where I think product marketing goes wrong, or people are dissatisfied with it, is they think they have it and then they just get dictated to by other organizations. And so the idea of like, if someone shows up and be like, I need a webinar to do X, Y, and Z. Like people show up with tactics like it's a short order cook. And I think that's I think the recipe for disaster for organizations. But the ones that are doing it well, and there are lots of them doing well. And you mentioned earlier kind of a support system. There's ShareBird and the Product Marketing Association and the PMA. There's all these organizations that I think are doing great work and sort of really highlighting and growing and elevating the practice and the function. I just feel I feel like we're at the precipice of something great. And I've just been really fortunate to be around some people doing really great work in that area.